The midday sun was beating down on the city sidewalk, but inside the small restaurant, the air was cool and smelled strongly of fresh coffee and frying bacon. It was a busy place, the kind of spot where the noise never really stopped. You could hear the clinking of metal spoons against ceramic bowls, the low hum of conversations from people sitting in the booths, and the constant whoosh of the big espresso machine behind the counter. It was a Tuesday, which meant the lunch rush was in full swing. A young woman moved through the narrow aisles between the tables with a kind of practiced speed. She looked to be in her mid-twenties, with her hair pulled back tight into a ponytail to keep it out of her face. She wore a standard uniform, a dark shirt and an apron tied around her waist which had already collected a few small stains from the shift. In one hand, she balanced 3 heavy plates loaded with burgers and fries, and in the other, she carried a pitcher of ice water. Her eyes were focused, scanning the room for who needed a refill or who was waving for the check. She worked at this restaurant 6 days a week. It was tiring work. Her feet usually hurt by noon, and she often went home smelling like grease. But she didn't complain. The tips were okay, and it paid the bills. To the customers sitting there, she was just the waitress. They saw her as someone who brought the food, cleared the empty plates, and smiled politely even when people were rude. They didn't know her name beyond the tag on her chest, and they certainly didn't know anything about her life outside these 4 walls. She placed the plates down in front of a family with 2 loud kids, giving them a quick "enjoy your meal" before turning away to head back toward the kitchen. As she walked, her eyes drifted, just for a second, toward the far corner of the room, near the large glass windows that looked out onto the street. Sitting there, shoved slightly into a corner to save space, was a piano. It was a beautiful instrument, much too fancy for a casual diner like this. It was a large, polished acoustic piano with a shiny black finish that reflected the overhead lights. It looked out of place next to a rack of pamphlets and a stand that held extra sugar packets. Most people walked right past it without giving it a second glance. To the regular customers, it was just another piece of furniture, like a potted plant or a coat rack. It was just the thing in the corner. But to her, it was the most important thing in the room. Every time she walked past it, she felt a little tug in her chest. She noticed the small layer of dust on the lid, which meant nobody had opened it in days. She noticed how the bench was tucked in neatly, unused. It was silent. It felt lonely. She slowed her pace as she passed by the windows, her fingers twitching slightly at her side. It was a subconscious movement, a reflex she couldn't control. Her fingers were tapping a silent rhythm against her leg, playing a song that only she could hear. Growing up, music had been her entire world. Her parents had bought an old, cheap keyboard when she was very young, and she had spent every afternoon teaching herself songs she heard on the radio. It was the one thing that made her feel like herself. While other kids were playing video games or hanging out at the mall, she was sitting in her room, figuring out chord progressions and melodies. It was her escape, her language, and her dream. She had always thought she would be doing that for the rest of her life. But life has a way of changing plans. Responsibilities piled up. Money got tight. The dream of performing or studying music had to be put on a shelf so she could work and help out her family. She told herself that one day she would get back to it, but one day had turned into years. Now, the only time she touched a keyboard was when she typed in an order on the cash register. She reached the kitchen counter and dropped off the empty plates she had collected on her way back. The chef, a sweaty man with a loud voice, yelled out a ticket number. She grabbed the next order and turned back around to face the dining room. The restaurant was still packed. The noise level was rising as more people came in to escape the heat outside. A man in a business suit was sitting at a table near the piano, typing aggressively on a laptop. He didn't even look up as she walked by. She wondered if he knew what a beautiful instrument was sitting just 2 feet away from his elbow. She doubted it. To him, and to almost everyone else here, the piano was just taking up space. She walked over to a booth where an elderly couple was sitting. They were sharing a dessert and talking softly. "Can I get you folks anything else?" she asked, her voice gentle and polite. They shook their heads and asked for the check. As she printed out the receipt, she looked back at the corner again. The sun was hitting the black lacquer of the piano, making it shine. It looked like it was sleeping. It looked like it was waiting. She remembered the feeling of her fingers pressing down on the keys, the weight of the ivory, and the vibration that would travel up her arms and into her chest. She remembered how playing could take all the stress and noise of the world and turn it into something beautiful. It felt like a lifetime ago. She sighed quietly and tucked the stray strand of hair behind her ear. It was time to get back to work. She had 3 tables waiting for refills, and a new family was walking through the glass entrance door. She straightened her apron, put on her customer service smile, and headed toward the new arrivals. But as she walked, her fingers twitched again at her side, tapping out a complex, fast-paced rhythm against the fabric of her pants. Her body was here, taking orders and carrying trays, but her mind was still in that corner, sitting on the bench, playing a melody that no one else could hear. The piano sat silently, holding onto a secret brilliance that was just waiting for the right moment to be let out. The lunch rush finally began to slow down, and the frantic energy in the air started to settle into a quiet, afternoon hum. The crowd thinned out, leaving behind a few people lingering over their coffee cups or typing quietly on laptops. The noise level dropped from a roar to a manageable murmur. The young woman wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, feeling the sticky tiredness that always set in after being on her feet for 4 hours straight. She walked over to a table by the window to clear away the dishes, glancing outside at the pedestrians hurrying past. It looked warm out there, and she was grateful for the cool air conditioning inside. She carried the stack of dirty plates back to the kitchen, balancing them carefully. The dishwasher was already running, filling the small space with steam. She dropped the dishes off and grabbed a clean cloth to wipe down the counter. The rhythm of her work was automatic now. Spray the cleaner, wipe in circles, rinse the cloth, repeat. Her mind was wandering a bit, thinking about the groceries she needed to buy later and the laundry piling up at home. It was the kind of mundane thinking that keeps you grounded but never really excites you. As she was polishing the metal napkin holder, she noticed the owner of the restaurant walking out of his office. He was an older man with kind eyes but a face that looked permanently tired. He was usually hidden in his office going through invoices and orders, but today he looked particularly stressed. He was rubbing his temples and sighing deeply, looking around the dining room with a frown. He walked over to the bar where the coffee machines were and leaned against it, staring at the empty stage area in the corner where the piano sat. She watched him for a moment, wondering if something was wrong. Usually, by this time of day, the owner would be joking with the regulars or checking on the cooks. Today, he just looked defeated. She decided to go over and see if he needed anything. Maybe a shipment was late, or maybe a vendor had raised prices again. It was always something in the restaurant business. She walked up to him gently. "Is everything okay?" she asked, keeping her voice low so the customers wouldn't hear. The owner jumped a little, pulled out of his thoughts. He looked at her and managed a weak smile. "Oh, hello. Yes, well, Mostly okay, he said, his voice sounding heavy. It's just been one of those days. The entertainment for the afternoon cancelled. She looked at him, confused. They didn't usually have big bands come in, just a small trio or a solo act to play soft jazz during the lunch and dinner shifts. The trio, she asked. Yeah, that's them, the owner replied, crossing his arms and looking back at the corner where the piano sat silently. Their van broke down on the highway. They're stuck about 50 miles from here. There's no way they're making it today. She looked over at the piano and then back at him. So, it's just going to be quiet today. That's the problem, the owner said, groaning slightly. Friday afternoons are usually busy, but people like the atmosphere. They like the music. If it's too quiet in here, it feels awkward. People eat faster and leave. I was really counting on them to keep the vibe good today. He paused, looking frustrated. I tried calling 2 other guys I know, but everyone is either booked or out of town. I hate having an empty room with no background noise. He looked at her, his eyes scanning her face as if he was looking for a solution. She knew he was stressed about money, as all business owners were. An empty restaurant meant lost revenue. She wanted to help him, but she wasn't sure what she could do. She couldn't pull a musician out of thin air. I'm sorry, she said sincerely. I hope you can find someone. The owner sighed again, tapping his finger on the counter. Then, he stopped. He looked at her more intently. Wait a minute, he said slowly. I remember when you filled out your job application. You listed some skills. Didn't you put down that you played the piano? She froze. Her heart skipped a beat, and her hands gripped the cleaning cloth a little tighter. She felt a sudden rush of heat to her face. She had forgotten that she even wrote that. It was 2 years ago when she applied. At the time, she had listed every skill she had, hoping to get the job. But she hadn't touched a piano seriously since she was a teenager. Yes, she stammered, feeling shy all of a sudden. I mean, I used to. It's been a long time, though. The owner didn't seem too concerned about the long time part. He just looked relieved to have a potential solution. How long, he asked. Years, she admitted. I don't really play anymore. The owner looked over at the shiny black instrument in the corner, then back at her with a hopeful expression. Look, it doesn't need to be a concert. I just need something. A few soft songs. Background noise, just some classic jazz or whatever you can remember. Anything is better than silence. She looked toward the corner of the room. The piano was sitting there, bathed in the afternoon light coming through the window. It looked different now. It wasn't just a piece of furniture anymore. It was an opportunity. But it was also terrifying. Her mind instantly flooded with doubts. What if her fingers were too stiff? What if she forgot the notes? What if she started playing and it sounded terrible? Everyone in the restaurant would hear. The people with their laptops, the couple in the corner, the guy on his phone. They would all know. I don't know, she said, looking down at her shoes. I'm pretty rusty. I wouldn't want to ruin the atmosphere. You won't ruin it, the owner said gently, sensing her hesitation. I've heard you humming while you work. You have good rhythm. Trust me, most people here aren't listening that closely anyway. They just want background noise. Just play for 10 or 15 minutes until the rush starts again. I'll make it worth your while. I'll add a bonus to your check for today. She hesitated. She thought about the extra money. That would definitely help with the bills. But more than the money, she felt a strange pull in her chest. A desire to touch the keys again. To see if she still had it. She looked around the room. The few people eating didn't seem to be paying any attention to them. They were wrapped up in their own worlds. "Okay," she heard herself say. It was a whisper, but the owner heard it. "Really?" he asked, his face lighting up. "That would be amazing. Thank you so much. Seriously, you're saving me here." She nodded slowly, trying to calm the nervous fluttering in her stomach. "Okay. I can try. But please don't be mad if it sounds bad." "It won't sound bad," he assured her. "Go take a break. Go wash your hands and sit down for a minute. Relax. I'll tell the staff to cover your tables for a bit." She untied her apron and folded it neatly, placing it on the counter where she usually stood to take orders. It felt strange to take it off in the middle of a shift. She felt exposed without it, like she was losing her armor. She walked toward the back room to wash her hands, scrubbing them extra hard under the warm water to make sure they were clean. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the sink. Her face looked a bit pale. "Come on," she whispered to her reflection. "You can do this. It's just a song." She walked back out into the dining room. It felt like a much longer walk than usual. The distance between the kitchen and the corner seemed to stretch out. As she got closer to the piano, she could smell the faint scent of old wood and varnish. The bench was exactly as she had seen it earlier, tucked in and waiting. She reached out and pulled the bench out, the legs scraping softly against the floor tiles. She sat down. It felt surreal. She was wearing her work clothes, her sneakers were firmly planted on the floor, and in front of her were the keys. They were white and black, clean and inviting. She ran her fingers lightly over the smooth surface of the keys without pressing them down. It was a familiar touch, one she hadn't realized she missed so much until this very second. The noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away, becoming a distant blur. It was just her and the instrument now. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment to find the courage, and then placed her hands in position to play. The young woman sat on the bench, her feet resting flat on the pedals below. It felt strange to be in this position without a tray of food in her hand or an order pad in her pocket. For a moment, she just sat there, letting the silence of the instrument settle around her. The piano was much bigger up close than it looked from across the room. It was a sturdy, imposing piece of furniture, smelling of wood wax and old memories. She flexed her fingers, feeling the stiffness in her joints from years of gripping heavy plates and mopping floors. Her hands looked rough and tired, a worker's hands, but she hoped they still remembered how to speak this language. She took a deep, shaky breath and tried to steady her racing heart. She felt exposed. There were no heavy curtains to hide behind, no walls to separate her from the diners. She was just sitting there in the open air of the restaurant, with the espresso machine hissing behind her and the clink of silverware echoing in the background. She knew that if she messed up, if the sound came out jarring or wrong, people would notice. They would stare. The thought made her throat feel tight. She closed her eyes for a second, just to block out the visual distractions. She tried to remember the feeling of being a kid alone in her room, playing for hours just because she loved it. She wasn't playing for tips then, and she wasn't playing for an audience. She was playing just to hear the music. She tried to find that quiet place inside herself again. When she opened her eyes, she looked down at the keys. They were arranged in the familiar pattern of black and white, a chaotic puzzle that made perfect sense to her. She lifted her hands and hovered them over the keys for a heartbeat. Then, she let them fall. The first chord she struck wasn't tentative or weak. She decided to play a piece she knew by heart, a complex classical song that she had practiced thousands of times in her youth. As her fingers pressed down, the sound that came out was deep, rich, and incredibly resonant. The piano was in surprisingly good tune, and the vibration of the strings hummed through the bench and into her body. It felt like waking up a part of her that had been asleep for a decade. For the first few measures, her playing was a bit stiff, like an athlete stretching cold muscles. Her fingers moved carefully, finding their footing. She played the opening notes clearly, letting them ring out into the room. She didn't look around to see if anyone was watching. She kept her eyes glued to the dancing patterns of her hands, afraid that if she made eye contact with someone, the magic would break. Slowly, the stiffness in her hands began to melt away. Her fingers remembered the pathways, the jumps from the low notes to the high notes, and the intricate rhythm that the song demanded. She started to play with more confidence. The sound was no longer just individual notes, it was becoming a melody, a flowing river of sound that filled the air. The atmosphere in the diner began to change almost instantly. It wasn't a loud or sudden change, but a shift in the energy of the room. At the tables near the front, people who had been typing furiously on their laptops slowed down. The aggressive clacking of keys stopped. A man in a suit who had been frowning at his screen lifted his head, his eyebrows drawn together in confusion as he searched for the source of the music. He probably thought the owner had turned on a high-quality stereo system. The music she was playing wasn't the simple, boring elevator music usually heard in restaurants. It was alive. It had peaks and valleys, moments of intense speed followed by soft, gentle whispers of sound. It was expressive in a way that felt raw and real. She began to add a little bit of her own flair, small changes in the timing that gave the song a bluesy, soulful feeling. It was a mix of the strict classical discipline she learned as a child and the emotions she had felt as an adult struggling through life. As she moved into the more difficult part of the song, her body started to relax. She stopped sitting so rigidly on the bench. She began to sway slightly with the music, her upper body moving forward as she reached for the high notes and leaning back as the music got deeper and louder. This wasn't the tired waitress anymore. The apron was gone, the worry about rent was gone, and the fatigue in her legs was forgotten. She was a musician, fully absorbed in the act of creation. A young couple sitting near the window stopped talking. They had been arguing quietly about something, but the music caught their attention. The woman turned her head toward the corner, a look of surprise crossing her face. She nudged her partner, and they both fell silent, listening. The music seemed to wrap around them, softening the edges of the room. The young woman hit a run of fast notes, her fingers flying across the ivory keys with a speed that blurred. It was a risky move, something she hadn't tried in years, but her fingers didn't falter. They knew exactly where to go. The sound cascaded down like a waterfall, clear and bright. She felt a rush of adrenaline that she hadn't felt in a long time. It was better than coffee, it was a pure surge of joy. She noticed, without really looking, that the background noise of the restaurant was fading away. The clatter of plates from the kitchen seemed to dim. The voices at the tables became hushed. People were putting down their forks. They were turning their heads. The realization that she was the center of attention started to dawn on her, but instead of making her nervous, it gave her a strange kind of courage. She wasn't just background noise anymore. She was being heard. She transitioned into the softer, more emotional middle section of the piece. The volume dropped, and the notes became delicate and fragile. She pressed the keys with tenderness, trying to express the feeling of longing that had been building up inside her for so many years. It was a sound that ached, a beautiful sadness that resonated with anyone who had ever had a dream they had to put aside. The man with the laptop finally closed his computer completely. He spun his chair around to face the corner, crossing his arms and listening intently. The elderly couple were holding hands across the table, their eyes closed, just letting the music wash over them. Even the staff behind the counter had paused. The barista, who was usually steaming milk non-stop, stood still with a pitcher in his hand, watching the young woman's back with a look of disbelief. She could feel the change in the air. It was heavier now, charged with emotion. The piano was singing, vibrating against her back, filling the entire space with its voice. She wasn't just pressing buttons, she was pulling feelings out of the instrument and offering them to the room. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt like she was good at something. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The fear was gone, replaced by a glowing warmth that spread from her chest all the way to her fingertips. She played on, lost in the brilliant world of sound she had created, daring to let herself shine. The music swelled, rising like a tide that was slowly pulling everyone in the room out to sea. It wasn't just background noise anymore, it was a living, breathing thing that demanded attention. The young woman was fully lost in it now. Her head was bowed slightly, her eyes closed so she could focus entirely on the sound, but her body was swaying with a rhythm that seemed to come from deep inside her bones. She wasn't thinking about the next note, she was just letting it flow. Her hands moved separately, the left playing a steady, heartbeat rhythm while the right hand danced wildly across the higher keys, playing a melody that was both happy and sad at the same time. The effect on the room was incredible. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the rest of the world. The espresso machine, which usually hissed and beeped every 30 seconds, seemed to have been forgotten by the staff. The barista stood behind the counter with a milk pitcher in mid-air, completely frozen, his eyes fixed on the corner. The cooks had even stopped clanging pots in the kitchen, poking their heads through the service window to see where that sound was coming from. At the tables, the change was even more obvious. A group of college students who had been laughing loudly and checking their phones fell silent one by one. They stopped texting. They stopped scrolling. They just sat there, mouth slightly open, listening. It wasn't the kind of music you could ignore. It pulled at you. It made you want to stop what you were doing and just feel it. The man in the expensive suit, who had been typing furiously just minutes before, looked at the woman in the corner with a look of pure confusion mixed with awe. He looked at his computer screen, then back at her, and slowly shook his head. He couldn't believe that this level of talent was hiding in a plain diner, played by someone wearing a t-shirt and sneakers. He pushed his laptop to the side completely, clearing the space in front of him, as if to give the music his full respect. The stress of his workday seemed to melt out of his shoulders as he leaned back, closing his eyes to listen better. The young woman played a complex run of notes, a fast flurry of sound that cascaded down the keyboard like a waterfall. Her fingers moved so fast they were almost a blur. It was a difficult technical section that usually required years of practice to master. She hit every note perfectly. The sound was crisp, clean, and precise, but it was full of emotion. It wasn't robotic, it was passionate. It sounded like she was telling a story, maybe a story about giving up on a dream and then finding it again by accident. The song began to build in intensity. She started playing harder, really digging into the keys. The piano responded with a louder, fuller sound that filled every corner of the restaurant. The low notes vibrated through the floor, rattling the silverware slightly on the tables. It was a powerful sound, a thunderous sound that felt like a storm rolling in. The tension in the music rose, making everyone hold their breath without even realizing it. She leaned forward, her shoulders hunching over the keys as she poured everything she had into the instrument. She was playing with a fierce kind of energy now. She wasn't the tired waitress anymore, and she wasn't the shy girl from the application form. She was a master of her craft. Every worry she had about rent, about being tired, about being invisible, it was all gone. It was all pouring out through her fingers. It was a release. It was the most honest thing she had done in years. The atmosphere in the room was heavy with emotion. An elderly woman sitting near the window wiped a tear from her cheek with a napkin. She didn't know the young woman, and she didn't know the song, but she could feel the raw emotion in the playing. It touched her. The music had transcended from just being nice to hear to something that made you feel things you hadn't felt in a long time. It reminded people of their own lives, their own lost dreams, and the beauty that still existed in the world. As the music reached its peak, the young woman's movements became larger. She stamped on the pedals, using the sustain to let the notes blend together into a wash of sound. Her hair fell out of her ponytail slightly, framing her face, but she didn't stop to fix it. She didn't care about how she looked. The music was taking her somewhere else. She played a series of dramatic chords, crashing and echoing, leading the song toward its finale. The tension was unbearable, hanging in the air like static electricity. Every single person in the room was focused on that corner. It was as if the entire world had shrunk down to just this space, this piano, and this music. The man with the laptop was tapping his foot silently on the floor. The barista had put the milk pitcher down and was leaning on the counter, captivated. She hit the final sequence of notes with power and conviction. Her hands jumped across the keyboard, striking the high notes that rang out like crystal bells, cascading down to the deep, resonant bass notes that shook the room. And then, in a moment of perfect timing, she pulled her hands off the keys and held them in the air, letting the final chord ring out. She pressed the damper pedal, letting the sound vibrate freely. The last chord hung in the air, loud and beautiful, slowly fading away into silence. It echoed off the walls, bouncing off the glass windows, filling the silence that followed. For 3 heartbeats, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence wasn't empty anymore, it was charged. It was filled with the ghost of the music that had just been played. The young woman sat there, her hands hovering over the keys, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. She was waiting for the sound to die down completely. She looked at the keys, almost surprised by what she had just done, as if her hands had a mind of their own. Slowly, the reality of the situation started to come back to her. She heard the hum of a refrigerator in the back. She felt the air conditioning blowing on her neck. She felt the ache in her fingers from the effort. But most of all, she felt the change in the room. She could feel dozens of pairs of eyes fixed on her. It was a heavy feeling, but it wasn't scary anymore. It was amazing. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't an awkward silence. It was a respectful one. It was the kind of silence you give to something truly beautiful, because you are afraid that if you make a noise, you might break the spell. The young woman sat on the bench, waiting for the noise of the world to rush back in, knowing that nothing in the restaurant would ever be quite the same. The final note faded away, disappearing into the air like smoke, but the feeling it left behind hung heavy and thick in the room. The young woman sat on the bench, her hands resting lightly on her knees. Her chest was heaving slightly, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. For a few seconds, she just stared at the black and white keys, almost scared to look up. She felt dizzy, her ears ringing slightly from the intensity of the sound she had just created. She had poured so much of herself into those few minutes that she felt empty, yet strangely full at the same time. She slowly lifted her head, expecting to see the usual scene, people glancing at their watches, ignoring her, maybe someone asking for more water. But what she saw made her freeze in surprise. Nobody was moving. The man with the laptop had completely turned his chair around. His mouth was slightly open, his glasses sliding down his nose as he stared at her. The college students had put their phones face down on the table, something that almost never happened. The elderly couple were looking at her with wet eyes, holding hands tightly. Even the staff, who were usually rushing around with their heads down, were standing still behind the counter. The cook had both hands on the edge of the service window, leaning out, his face a mask of pure amazement. For a moment, there was absolute silence. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. The young woman felt a flush of heat rise up her neck and into her cheeks. She suddenly felt very exposed. She wasn't a waitress anymore, and she wasn't just background noise. She was seen. Truly seen. It was a terrifying and wonderful feeling all at once. Then, from the back of the room, the sound of a single pair of hands clapping broke the quiet. It was the older gentleman who had been sitting with his wife. He was clapping slowly, with a deep, deliberate rhythm. A second later, the businessman in the suit joined in. Then the college students. Within moments, the entire restaurant erupted. It wasn't just polite applause. It was loud, genuine, and enthusiastic. People started standing up. The businessman stood up first, clapping enthusiastically, a genuine smile breaking across his stressed face. The elderly couple struggled a bit to get up from their booth, but they stood, beaming at her. Soon, almost everyone in the diner was on their feet. The sound filled the room, echoing off the walls much louder than the piano ever could. It was a wall of sound coming at her, washing away her fears. The young woman sat there, stunned. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap. She had played in small recitals when she was a kid, but she had never received a reaction like this. These people didn't have to clap. They didn't know her. They were just people who wanted coffee and lunch, but she had managed to touch something inside them. She realized then that the music wasn't just for her. It was a bridge she had built to them, a way to say things she couldn't put into words. She felt a lump form in her throat, and her eyes watered. She quickly wiped them with the back of her hand, not wanting to cry in front of everyone. She stood up from the bench, feeling a little shaky on her legs. She looked out at the sea of faces. They weren't looking through her anymore. They were looking at her, really seeing her. They didn't see a tired worker in a stained uniform, they saw an artist. They saw the brilliance she had kept hidden away for so long. She gave a small, awkward curtsy, followed by a shy nod. It wasn't a formal bow, but it was honest. The applause seemed to get even louder after that. Someone whistled from the back. The owner came out from behind the counter, clapping his hands above his head. He walked over to her, his face glowing with happiness. He didn't say anything at first, just gave her a proud pat on the shoulder. That simple gesture meant more to her than any tip she had ever received. Slowly, the applause began to die down, and people started to sit back down, but the mood in the room had changed completely. The cold, rushed atmosphere was gone. It felt warmer, lighter. As people went back to their food, they were talking to each other, smiling, and laughing. The tension had broken. The young woman walked back toward the counter to grab her apron. As she passed the tables, people stopped her. A young girl reached out and touched her arm. "That was beautiful," she said softly. The businessman nodded at her as she walked by. "You have a real gift," he said sincerely. "Thank you for sharing that." It wasn't just flattery, you could hear the truth in their voices. She wasn't invisible anymore. She tied her apron back around her waist, the rough fabric feeling familiar again, but she felt different wearing it. She felt taller. Her hands, which had felt so tired and stiff an hour ago, now felt alive and buzzing with energy. The owner came over to the register to ring in an order, but he paused. He looked at her, really looked at her, as if he was seeing a new person. "You know," he said, leaning on the counter, "that bench in the corner, it has your name on it now. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. If you want it, of course." She looked at him, then back at the piano sitting in the sunlit corner. It wasn't just a piece of furniture anymore. It was a stage. It was a second chance. She thought about her bills, her tired feet, and the long shifts, but she also thought about the way the music made her feel. She thought about the connection she had just made with a room full of strangers. "I'd like that," she said, and a genuine smile spread across her face, a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. She turned around and picked up a coffee pot to refill a customer's cup. As she moved through the room, the noise of the diner returned, clinking spoons, chatting voices, the hiss of the machine, but underneath it all, there was a new melody playing in her head. She walked with a spring in her step that hadn't been there before. She was still a waitress, and she still had a long shift ahead of her, but she wasn't just serving food anymore. She was an artist, and she knew that no matter what life threw at her, she had her music, and she had a voice. She had unveiled her brilliance, and the world had stopped to listen.